Hello Blogsmith clients and friends. The purpose of this video is to dive into the current state of AI writing tools, AI search, ChatGPT, GPT-4, a lot of different things that I want to cover today. So stay with me if these are things that you're concerned about or that you're just curious about. How do they affect content marketing and ranking in search? I'm going to go through a lot of little details and documentation that comes from Google, go through some examples of where tools like this might be useful, but also talk about the limitations of AI writing tools. And so with all that, let's go ahead and just dive in here. The first thing I wanted to address are Google guidelines about AI generated content. So previously in Google's quality rater guidelines, they talked about AI generated content as if it were spam. They used words like that. It wasn't always a direct correlation, but it was heavily implied that they considered AI generated content to be spam and therefore not likely to rank. So this is the page. I'm going to include all of these links in the description of this video. But essentially it goes through a really useful FAQ for understanding how they currently think about this and how things really have changed since some of the older versions of the quality rater guidelines. The most up-to-date version that I've reviewed of the quality rater guidelines, and I think the most up-to-date one that exists, is from the end of 2022. So they usually don't update it more than twice a year. Sometimes they don't update it in a year. So that should be pretty relevant, for the next, let's say, 6 months or so. But anyway, I wanted to highlight some specific FAQ questions that I think are probably most relevant to the work that we do together, just content marketing in general for anybody watching this who isn't a Blogsmith client. And so here are some questions that I'm focusing on and essentially my interpretation of them. So first of all, is AI content against Google search's guidelines? They say appropriate use of AI or automation is not against our guidelines. So that's really interesting. This means that it is not used to generate content primarily to manipulate search rankings, which is against our spam policies. We're going to dive into kind of what they mean by this next when we talk about specifically the Google helpful content algorithm update, which we did cover late into last year in another one of these update videos. And so I'll touch on that again and kind of what that means in terms of AI content and just the idea of writing for humans versus robots. But it is again interesting to hear them clearly state really that AI content is not against their guidelines. It's just that there are certain stipulations that would be required in order for it to rank in relevant search. And that's kind of what these other questions are touching on. So let's dig into that. They say, will AI content rank highly on search? So they say using AI doesn't give content any special gains. Makes sense. It's just content. If it is useful, helpful, original, and satisfies aspects of EEAT, which if you're not familiar, it used to be EAT, but they added another dimension to that. And that is something that I'm pretty sure was covered in the most recent version of the Google Quality Rater Guidelines. So definitely something to dive into, whether you're familiar with EAT or not, but just this sort of expanded guidance of, how they prioritize content that ranks. And when it comes to EAT or EEAT, this is really specifically relevant for topics, especially that fall under the category of what Google defines as your money, your life, which also has an evolving definition, but typically involves things where people are giving advice that could really impact just somebody's livelihood. So some things that they've said in the past as examples are things like advice about choosing where to go to college, or I will be sharing also some examples later in this video about things that have to do with financial concepts and ratios and things like that. So we can dive into that a little bit more. It's kind of outside of the scope of what we're talking about today, but is, definitely an interesting just thing to dig into more if you're curious about SEO, how it works, how Google considers, certain things within its quality rater guidelines and ultimately what it ranks in relevant search. So they're basically saying, if AI can generate truly useful, helpful, original, and content that satisfies EAT, it might do well in search. So that's the wording here is actually very interesting. They say if it doesn't, it might not. They're not really being committal here. So they're saying, yes, there's this possibility, but we're neither kind of confirming nor denying it, which I think is really interesting. And some of the experiments that I've seen people share on Twitter, for example, where they're creating AI content and publishing it, and where it is ranking, a lot of people note that they don't really expect it to continue ranking, especially for things that they didn't really add anything, unique or useful to, where they're just strictly using AI, generating content, publishing it, and then not really doing much else. So I think that that's really notable. That is a concept that we're going to dive into more when we talk about AI tools a little bit later. So then, last, most interesting question. Again, I definitely encourage you to look at this page that I'll link, because there are certainly more. But last one that I think is most relevant to us today is, should I use AI to generate content? And so they say, if you see AI as an essential way to help you produce content that is helpful and original, it might be useful to consider. That original, again, the wording here is really telling and interesting. If you see AI as an inexpensive, easy way to gain search engine results, then no. So again, Google is still kind of making it clear that AI content, it's really not the be-all and end-all to use a tool and just publish something and not add anything unique and interesting to it. We are going to talk about the limitations of AI tools and why that's relevant as well. So lots of things to say, but essentially what I'm taking away from really these like particular FAQs from their own guidance is that AI content can be useful to sort of kick things off, but you still need that unique human touch. And so let's kind of do a little refresher here about Google's helpful content update. And again, I want to remind you, and I will link to this video that we did in fall 2022, which was really digging into a lot of algorithm updates that happened really in a row. I mean, there were several here in October, September, 2 in September, another one in August, July, May, March. Man, it was a busy year for SEOs and trying to keep up with all the latest things. But really, for algorithm updates like this, it's always interesting to try to find the trends and to try to understand the decisions that Google makes. And I think what they've always prioritized is the idea that content is king. Good content, will get the best rankings and relevant search. And so that's always what we try to create at the Blogsmith, is something that's really useful, something that's reader-centric, and something that is truly helpful content. So let's go back into some of these slides here to just dive into a refresher of the major points. So what is the helpful content update? It's part of Google's long-term efforts to provide original and valuable content to its users through search results. It rewards content that meets users' expectations while demoting content written primarily with search engines in mind. So this is good, right? This kind of tracks with what we were just reviewing in terms of AI content. It seems that these ideas, the helpful content update, as well as like their new guidance on AI content, kind of fit together. They're still saying that ultimately the human reader is the one that we are trying to appease. And it's really where robots play into things is helping to match your content with the right human reader, assuming that you've created truly useful and good content that is worth matching with that human. Which is also the premise of my book, which I'll mention again at the end of this or somewhere in the middle of it, actually pretty soon. But let's review some of the things that are notable in terms of how they talk about the helpful content update. And I think I also have a resource here. So this is from Google's, again, their own blog, their own like exact wording. What I have on these next slides is basically these questions which help you to understand, what does people first content look like and how to avoid creating content for search engines first. So let's look at these. It's asking yourself questions to determine if it's people first, primarily. Does your site have a primary purpose or focus? Like, do you tend to be sort of focused around the same categories? If you're a website that is talking about, I don't know, sales best practices, are you throwing in stuff that feels really random about, maybe some other department like PR or something? I mean, it could be related depending on your tool, for example, but it also could be something that like doesn't have a fit at all if most of what you're talking about is sales. So that's just one example. Are you keeping in mind our guidance for core updates and for product reviews? So again, like reviewing algorithm changes and making sure that you're sort of continuing to be compliant and you're not trying to game the system. After reading your content, will someone leave feeling they've learned enough about a topic to help achieve their goal? So again, like, does it satisfy the intent? These are all questions that we ask ourselves during our keyword research process that helps us to create something that is unique and that is useful ultimately, which again, when we're talking about AI content, or any content, it has to be useful, helpful, original, and satisfy aspects of EAT. So these are all goals that we have. So on the flip side, are you taking a search engine first approach to your content? So a couple questions that you can ask yourself, again, from Google's standpoint, are things like, is the content primarily to attract people from search engines rather than being made for humans? One thing that I'm going to share in a moment here is our style guide and really how we've crafted it to be very reader-centric and to focus on the human reader experience, to provide a great content user experience for these human readers, also for search engine spiders and robots, but really secondary to the humans that are intended to consume it, that are the audience that is most able to buy from you. Robots don't have money yet. So again, asking questions like that. Another, I think, really important one is, are you mainly summarizing what others have to say without adding much value? So that's where things like originality and uniqueness come into play. It doesn't really make sense. We already have so much content on the web. It doesn't make sense to add something that looks exactly like what's already out there, or even just iterating on it slightly so that you beat the top, current ranking result. What we try to do at the Blogsmith is weave your brand into it so that it is truly unique because it's coming from that perspective. But it's also about considering what angles haven't been covered yet. How can we make this something that is useful, even if somebody already has read something about this topic? So that's really important. This kind of relates to like the last question on the people-centric side. Does your content leave readers feeling like they need to search again to get better information from other sources? So, I think these questions are another great thing to dig into if you're curious about SEO, if you just want a better understanding about this particular algorithm update. This is another just great way kind of at a glance to understand if you're creating something that is truly helpful or if it's more unhelpful, if it feels crafted, primarily for search, which Google is not going to rank high then if they detect it. And so, people first versus search engine first, genuine versus spammy, specific versus generic, actionable versus abstract, up-to-date versus outdated. That's another important thing. I think one thing that we always try to talk to clients about at the Blogsmith is the idea of not only creating new content, but refreshing what already exists and making sure that, that's putting our best foot forward, that people are always landing on something when they come from search, for example, that is timely and relevant and not outdated, especially I think in the industry that we mainly operate in, which has to do with digital marketing and working with B2B technology companies. Stats change frequently, best practices change frequently. And so this particular point is especially relevant to our clients. Things like being relatable versus impersonal, that definitely makes sense from a human point of view. Concise versus fluffy. We operate currently based on word count, but as you can tell by reading through our style guide, we are always looking for ways to cut out things that are redundant, that are not concise, that are not getting to the point. We understand that human readers, tend to skim to find answers, and we just want to create, again, a really great reader experience for them, because that's how we create a great brand connection between your search audience, your readers, and your brand. And then satisfying versus lacking. A lot of the questions that Google poses really talk about this specifically, so that's another important point. So a couple resources. We have this blog about Google's helpful content update if you want to dive into this particular topic a little bit more. We also, actually, I wanted to share, I forgot to pull it up, but we do have another blog about algorithm updates in general, which was really written in terms of, here it is. So I'll definitely link this too. This was written in terms of, again, that previous video that I created where we had a ton of algorithm updates in a really short amount of time, especially, like fall 2022, but really 2022 in general just had so many algorithm updates. And so this is another great resource. Both of these are by writers that work on content for Blogsmith clients, but these particular pieces are for the Blogsmith blog. And then I'm really excited about this. This is a new resource. So this is our style guide. Many of you have seen it, but many of you have seen it in Google Docs format, which is fine, but it's kind of lacking that really wonderful reader experience. And so what we did, and again, all these links will be included in the description, but what we did was we created kind of like an online chapter book version so that we could create a better reader experience. And part of it too was to really share this with, not just clients, but other writers, other freelance writers in general, and really to share what we know, because we put a lot of thought and effort into this, and I'll just kind of scroll as I talk. I will also mention that there is a downloadable PDF version too, so you don't necessarily have to come back to this page, but you can just kind of scroll through this table of contents, or you can click to navigate. You can also scroll. We have some helpful examples where relevant. But again, a lot of this is, you've maybe already seen it in our style guide, but it's just, everything that we want to share about our style, both to just be transparent, but also to encourage others to think about online style from our perspective, and hopefully to add to it, to use it for their own projects, but to also suggest things to make it better. This is totally a work in progress. We add to our own internal version of this often. And so the idea is that we'll continue to update this public-facing version of it, probably quarterly or so, as we find new things to add that are useful, beyond just like our own internal processes. So yeah, really proud of that. Just wanted to kind of sneak that in. I'll also mention my book. And so the book and the style guide are very complementary. The book is kind of expanding on it. It's adding more examples. It's adding what to do, examples of what not to do versus what to do. And really, if you're familiar with AP style, our style guide reiterates a lot of it. Probably 30% of it is reiterating it and saying, like, we use this rule because of AP style. But it's also building on it, because AP style is news journalism style, but it wasn't written specifically for the internet. It considers the internet. Our style is about the internet. So just to give a little bit of a lesson in how we came to those decisions. And just for the sake of fun, here's the physical book. Available on Amazon in print and Kindle. Okay, so let's get back to just talking about AI writing tools. I wanted to talk a little bit about the current limitations of AI writing tools. And I will also spend some time talking about the great possibility of AI writing tools and AI tools in general. But this is an article I wrote for the Fast Company Executive Board. It's called 5 Reasons AI Writing Bots Aren't Taking Your Job Anytime Soon, but How to Use Them Instead. And I wrote this because I wanted to just dive into, again, really like the limitations of what these tools can do, what they can do, what they can't do. And just kind of set the record straight, because I think a lot of people are worried about the implication of what this means for writing in general, for content marketing. If people like me still have a job, and there are many reasons why I think, honestly, it's going to take a while for them to catch up to us. So I'll just reiterate a couple points here. I think the biggest one is just the fact that AI doesn't have empathy. I think one of the examples that I shared in this article was, I'm trying to see if I can find it really quick, but it was something like a quote from Stephen King. Big fan. I don't know how the man, writes so many awesome books in so short of a period of time. It's almost like he is a robot, but it hasn't been proven yet. So just like the different turns of phrases he used. So this is one from his book, Needful Things. The trust of the innocent is the liar's most useful tool. And my question, is this really something a computer could have come up with? At this point, they can come up with a lot. I think one thing that's also just worth mentioning in general, and I might have said it in here somewhere, I did say it here, is just the idea that AI is trained on the work of humans. And so it isn't really original, right? It's trained on things that people have written, on the collective knowledge of what's been published on the internet. And so to some extent, AI writing is plagiarism. So I'm going to jump around a little bit right now to share something that I started to hint at a little bit earlier when we talked about Your Money, Your Life. And so you might have heard about the CNET articles. One of their child brands is called Bankrate. And so Bankrate came out around the time that ChatGPT started to become a thing, where a lot of people were tweeting about it, talking about it, wondering about it, experimenting with it. And they came out to say, guess what? Our articles are written by AI, or like a set of them are written by AI. We do have a human editor go through and, make sure that it's okay to publish. We have a human fact checker go through, because again, Bankrate is talking about financial topics which can affect people's livelihood, which again is really important, something that Google specifically talks about in the quality rater guidelines, which I'm just realizing is another resource that I need to link, because I did a deep dive on the Blogsmith blog about that. So that's a note to self. And again, if you want to dig into it without reading the 175 plus pages that it currently is, then that would be a good resource, because I've gone through, annotated it, pulled out really specific examples to explain concepts. But yeah, so this idea of EEAT and how it relates to Your Money, Your Life is really important for a lot of clients that we speak with, or that we write for, because they're influencing purchasing decisions. So it's not so much, B2C Your Money, Your Life, but it really is B2B Your Money, Your Life. So anyway, getting back to the point here, CNET basically came out to say, hey, all this, buzz about AI tools and things like that, guess what? We're using them, we're publishing it, we do have human oversight, but ultimately these articles are created by AI. And so people at first, they didn't really know what to think, but then almost immediately after they came out and admitted it, which I think one of the big questions was, well, is Google going to rank these pieces, or is it going to, become a problem where they're going to start getting deranked or penalized in search? And it's kind of hard to say exactly what the current state of affairs is, because again, we've reviewed what Google's guidelines are for AI content. Things can shift over time, but what did happen, and let's see if this is the next one. So people dug in, right, to the content, and they found some fundamental issues that the human editors did not find. And it's probably because of, my guess, my theory is just the bias that AI tools, they're using the information they have. They're probably right, But one of the things, and I might have said this in my Fast Company article, is the fact that tools, especially like ChatGPT, which I'll give you a specific example of in a moment, are confidently incorrect. One of the limitations of ChatGPT, which may no longer be the case now that GPT-4 just came out, is that ChatGPT data was only timely, relevant, correct as of about mid-2021 when it first came out, which was in 2022. It was like earlier this year, maybe end of last year. And so anything that happened after that, ChatGPT just didn't know about. It was, outside of its sphere of genius. It was outside of its stores that it could call from. So that's really notable, especially if we're talking about your money or life, because things do change in the financial world. A recent example is the Silicon Valley Bank stuff that happened. So the bots that are writing about things that affect how we make decisions about who to bank with or how to take out a specific type of loan, which I think is what specifically was covered in this article. It's just not aware of that. And so it can't give fully useful advice because, at least at the time, it wasn't accounting for anything that happened after mid-2021. And so if we dig in here, let's see if I can find... Okay, so here's like a formula about compound interest. And what Futurism is saying, who's kind of, being the watchdog on these CNET, Bankrate, AI-generated content articles. So it says, it sounds authoritative, this example, but it's wrong. The person the AI is describing, the calculation didn't match up exactly. And so it's explaining like why that calculation was wrong. There are other errors. This one was about how loans work. And so I'm not going to go into all the details or read this full article to you, but I will link to it if you're curious about kind of like the extent of the issues that were, found by Futurism and by others for these Bankrate articles. So then, the last thing that I've also hinted at that we'll talk about today is that these articles, because they're trained on human content, existing content, are effectively plagiarism. And so they give a couple examples here. And you could see, for example, this is a CNET article, but it was, comparable to something previously published in Forbes Advisor. And again, here's, a quote from it, a specific excerpt from it. And here's another example where it's very similar. There are some variations, but that's kind of what article spinning is, which is something as an industry SEOs have really decried. Here's another example. Again, the title is exactly the same, with some punctuation and capitalization changes. But again, the excerpt is a little bit different. It's spun content, but it is based on something that a human wrote, and that wasn't properly credited. At the Blogsmith, we do extensive plagiarism checks, including now with AI content. We use a couple of different tools to detect it. If people are using AI content tools, our stance right now is that we don't allow AI content tools, AI writing tools specifically, to be used in creating content for our clients. We are playing around with them. We're certainly doing research and seeing how they could help the process. But at this point, we have kind of a zero tolerance policy, and we correlate it to plagiarism because that's what it is if you're using it to generate the actual written parts of your content. So again, you can read through this article. I just want to go through a few other points from my Fast Company article. Another big one is that AI writing tools at this point doesn't really understand or capture tone of voice or nuance. I think nuance is still something that is very uniquely human. So again, that's kind of where that Stephen King quote comes in. It can't really art direct visual content. Another big value that we provide to our clients is creating custom on-brand imagery. That involves back and forth between the writer, our designers, Having original ideas to create this imagery. Certainly there are AI image tools that can do a lot of really cool, amazing things, and I've been playing with them myself, but it comes back to that same sort of ethical issue of, there are plenty of examples. There's one here where the art is kind of directly attributable to a human artist who's not getting credited, and who certainly wasn't compensated for their work being trained on by these AI visual tools. At this point, I don't think AI understands or factors in the reader experience. You can prompt something like ChatGPT to format something a certain way if you know how you want it formatted, but that doesn't necessarily mean that it can come up with that on its own. It can help you format it, and it could probably do it quickly and effectively, but you still need to give it that input. And then, the last thing is really just the fact that really all algorithms are biased. And the whole idea, again, of confidently incorrect, which I do have an example of that. We are going to talk about how to use AI writing tools. I just want to make sure that there's nothing else that I wanted to share with you. I think that kind of covers that. So let's talk a little bit just about ChatGPT. What was I going to share? Oh, there's one other thing I wanted to talk about. This is a very recent article, literally came out yesterday, and it's something that, shakes things up. And so essentially this article, again from Google, is talking about generative AI capabilities within Google tools like Google Docs. And so they give this example, which is crazy. And it's, you write a job post for a regional sales rep, and you see that it just generates, this the title, the job description, responsibilities, qualifications. And so, it's important to kind of know what the capabilities are, but I think it's just as important to realize, based on some of the things I've already said, that, there's nothing really unique about this, right? It's a great place to start for sure. I think AI writing tools in general really are helpful for not starting with a blank page, for example. But beyond that, if you want something, if we're talking specifically about ranking in Google search, it still needs to be unique. It needs to be original. It needs to be helpful. It needs to be thoughtful. And this just isn't it. It's a starting point. It is really cool. I mean, I have to admit that. So ChatGPT, I've been playing around with it, not so much to write things, but to just do different tasks and to sort of ask it for help with things. I'll give you an example, which is I was trying to figure out how to do something in Zapier, and I was just hitting a wall. And so I kind of was chatting with ChatGPT to share, this is what I've tried, this is what I'm trying to do. And I asked it, what are some of the potential issues that, I might be missing? And it came up with a lot of good ideas. And I took some of those ideas, and then I was okay, so how would you fix it if this was the issue? And again, the limitation was, for example, I was trying to create a zap between one of the apps we use in Airtable, and it was describing how to do things in Airtable that weren't currently relevant because, again, like I said, it doesn't know what happened. At least, it might be different now because, as you can see here, it's using GPT-4, which just came out. But at the time, a week or two ago when I did this prompt, it was still using that mid 2021 data, and Airtable had evolved since then. And so it was really useful from one standpoint, but it was also very limited, and it ultimately didn't fully help me solve the problem. I think I still had to get in touch with Zapier's support. But again, I could see how having this interactive interface that, I can kind of do my own tutorial. I can sort of tutor myself for how to do these things is really useful if I don't have, a Zapier expert that I can consult with at any hour. It's a good first start. It's just that I couldn't really count on it in the end to really solve my problem, right? Because it was lacking context, the context of how Airtable currently works. So that's just one example. I have just a couple other like Twitter examples. So here's one about, I asked ChatGPT the best way to build a WordPress website, and the answer is not very good. It was just this sort of like, first you need a domain name and a hosting provider, and then you need to choose a theme, and it's like, it's so, like, maybe again, his prompt is kind of generic, right? Like, this isn't a perfect example, but it's just like it's so generic. And so if we go back to just the idea of like, what is helpful content, generic is not helpful, specific is. And part of it, sure, is the prompt, but it's also trying to understand the intent of the user, which I don't think ChatGPT really does yet. I think one of the biggest things that I hear about people who use it, who are very confident, experienced users in terms of, this being a new technology, it's them saying how they always have to sort of alter what they're saying. And so there are implications for this being used in Bing search, in Google search, and we will talk about that. And I promise I'm almost done. I know this is very long-winded, but there are a lot of different sort of things to cover. Here's a really great use case. So Jimmy says, okay, now this could be an awesome use case for ChatGPT, extracting quotes from testimonial transcriptions. So I want to share his example. And I also want to share that to put this video together, to put, I guess, like my notes for this video together, what I did was I recorded myself doing a voice memo, and then I fed the transcript into ChatGPT, and I said, listen, here's like the 5, sections that I want to talk about: the helpful content update, the limitations of AI tools, good use cases of AI tool, stuff like that. And then it basically created an outline for me, which I then sort of like expanded with, the different sources I wanted to use. And so I'm telling you this because I think that's a really great use case of ChatGPT, is to sort of like help you organize content you already have. And that's essentially what Jimmy is talking about here. So let's just like look, because I think this is really cool. So he's basically saying, this is my product. Here's what it's notable for, at least in terms of what I want you to read this transcript from a customer, and, feed me back the most impactful quotes so that he can then use that to, create his own marketing materials, to understand the voice of the customer, for example. So here's what ChatGPT gave him back. Instead of having to manually go through the transcript himself, it gave him just point by point, this is what you said you wanted, this is what I found. I'm sure it saved him a ton of time. And then he asked it, can you give me some more? And that was the output. So so cool. This is something I want to do myself. This is inspiring to me, and I think this is an excellent ChatGPT use case. So yeah, we've talked about some limitations of AI tools. I wanted to touch a little bit on some other good use cases. And so this is another post. This is actually, I think originally from 2021. And so we just talked a little bit about a lot of the same things I've already mentioned, what it can't do, but also what it can do, some tools that we've played around with, and ultimately the idea that they can be a really great starting point. Just the idea, again, that you're not starting with a blank page. I think that's what these tools are great for. And so not a whole lot else to add there. This is going to be outdated now, some of this stuff, so this article is definitely due for an update. But another good article, if you want to dig into using these tools effectively, I think there are some good use cases here. I will say another tool that I didn't add here, but that I always talk about, is this tool called WordTune. So it's a Google Docs add-on. And what it does is you write something and then it suggests ways to rewrite it. And I think that's such a great use of AI writing tools, because you're giving it the input and it's your original content, and it's just really great for if, say, for example, you're just like, I don't know what word to use, or like, this sounds awkward and I've like spent all my creative energy on the rest of this piece. So that's a great one because it's working, like you're training it. You're giving it the inputs instead of expecting it to solve your problems. The other tools that I wanted to talk about, they're not so much about generative text, although some of these tools, I think especially Phrase, can do AI writing. We don't use it for that. But these are 3 tools that we use at the Blacksmith to help with our SEO keyword research. ClearScope is something that we use on the front end, but really like also at the back end, when we're finishing off a draft. Phrase is something we use to brief content creation, to suggest like research sources or stats and things to look into. Market Muse, it does a lot of the same things. I think we mostly use it for semantic keywords. So you could probably use one of these tools, and if I were to choose one, I would say ClearScope, but we have access to all of them, so we use all of them as part of our extensive keyword research process. So these tools all use some aspects of AI, machine learning, but we don't use them for generative text. This article dives into some of the ways we do use them. And if you're a Blacksmith client, you'll notice that, for example, we always include, if we use ClearScope, if it's 1,000+ word article, that's kind of our standard for using it. We include that link on the document that we send you. We also have an explainer video about how to understand that document. So I'm not going to dive much deeper into it, but if you want to learn about, I think like really cool AI tools that can help with content optimization specifically, that's what these are. And I'll include this link, with all the other ones that I've mentioned as well. So I promise we are almost done. I have like one more thing to talk about. I mentioned earlier that we're testing some AI detection tools. One of them's called Originality. I'm going to include links to the other ones. And so we use a minimum of 2 AI detection tools per piece to find any red flags. What else? The last thing I think I wanted to touch on is AI search, because I think that that's something that a lot of people are worried about, that they're thinking about, that they're wondering, how that affects really content marketing and SEO moving forward. And I think that's a very valid concern. And I think that's something as an industry that SEOs and content marketers, I don't think we have all the answers yet, because it's really still in its infancy. I will say that I think it will fundamentally change the nature of search. But I don't know exactly by how much. Some of the things I think about, and this is just, one last Google supplied article about Google Bard is what they're calling their AI search. Microsoft Bing also has their own version of this, which I think was really just recently updated with the GPT-4 most recent updates. I know Google, I don't think this is fully rolled out yet, and part of it is honestly because there were some confidently incorrect things that happened as a result of them maybe launching a little bit too fast, or launching even like their beta too fast. And so you can definitely read about that if you're curious. But, there are some examples here in terms of how it works. And so again, it's kind of like this idea of typing something into search, getting a response. I think one thing that concerns me as a content marketer who has this symbiotic relationship with Google is that the answers that it gives, as you can see in this GIF screenshot situation here, it's not giving any attribution. So unlike other SERP features like a featured snippet, which do, summarize an answer but also link back to a source, there is zero attribution here. And I think that is a situation to me that reads like plagiarism, that kind of bites the hand that feeds it in a way, because Google is relying on us content creators to create content to be able to provide these answers. And so my hope is that they will reconsider, how they're sourcing this information and how they're attributing it, especially. I can't predict what they're going to do. I think that as an industry, we have to take a stand if this is how it actually, turns out. But the other thing I think about to try to, I guess, ease any qualms you might have, going back to the quality rater guidelines, they have these different definitions of queries, and they attribute them specifically to mobile search results, but most of these different definitions also relate to desktop search. And so one of the queries is called no simple queries, KNOW. And what these are, to give you an example, and one that they use, I think specifically in the quality rater guidelines, it's like, when's Abraham Lincoln's birthday or something. And so that's something that has one answer. It's straightforward. There's not a whole lot of deliberation or extra context needed to answer that question. And so I think one thing that we can do as an industry, as content marketers, to maybe evade the worst of the impact of this on ranking and relevant search is to immediately stop trying to optimize for no simple queries. I think as a company, The Blacksmith doesn't focus on these things in general. I think we're trying to get, no simple would be something very high up in the top of the sales funnel. It's, hard to even attribute it to a specific audience because it's so generic, which again, if we go back to the helpful content update, algorithm update, that's something that we know that we're not supposed to go after anyway, because that's more for search than for humans. And so I think one thing to hopefully put your mind at ease a little bit is just the idea that we're not really going after those queries anyway. But for anybody else who might be creating content, I think this is just a note to immediately cut that out. The other thing that I was going to say is, I think this is something a lot of people like to complain about, recipe websites, right? And, they always have this long story about their grandma or whatever before they get to the recipe. So they should be worried, right? Because something like this is going to fundamentally change the landscape for them, especially because they're creating all this content to try to have more, keywords and relevance and just content length, I guess, and thinking that that's going to help them rank. But I think for B2B technology, software as a service, where we can really win and beat Google at its own AI games is by creating things that are truly unique, that feature the brand, this idea of product-led content. And that's something that still benefits a lot from nuance. And so you really have to read the article to get the nuance or to see the imagery. I'm not sure that Google Bard at this point is incorporating imagery. I'm sure they will at some point, but I don't know, that they're going to be able to include all relevant imagery or moving imagery like a GIF or something. And if they did, then that's why it's important to have things that are custom branded, for example, because I don't think they're going to be able to, at least ethically, strip out the branding. So, just to kind of end this off, and for anybody who's made it this far, thank you for sticking with it. I know, again, just a lot of different things that we've talked about today. I think the greatest takeaways that I have for you are just, again, prioritizing the human reader experience without neglecting the things you have to do for search, but again, putting the human first, focusing on things that are not these no simple top of the funnel queries, putting more time and effort into the middle and the bottom of the funnel, and how your products and services weave into things to add that essential nuance, to get people, eager to read more, to see what it is that you can do to differentiate from this very, sanitized response that Google is suggesting. So yeah, really just adding context and storytelling to content, and just noting that the current limitations with AI ultimately don't make for a major change in how the Blacksmith approaches SEO. So again, find all the links to the resources I've mentioned in the description of this video. Thank you again for staying with me if you've made it this far. And rest assured that the Blogsmith as a company, we are always kind of watching and listening what's happening in search, and we'll continue to update you as major changes happen. And I just want to reassure you that these are things that we're not taking like sitting down. We're looking into it, we're seeing what that impact is on you, on us, and we're staying sharp, because that's what you have to do to be the best in SEO.